Welcome and thank you for joining. Today's webinar, as part of our My Journey, My Roots program, explores the current landscape of anti-racism in British Columbia. Despite some perceiving racism as a thing of the past, the reality is that people continue to face significant obstacles due to their race, ethnicity, and cultural background. We hope to provide an inclusive, informative, and safe space for learning. My name is Stephanie Jiang, the coordinator of Pacific Canada Heritage Centre Museum of Migration Society, a hub for intercultural learning of our peoples and stories. I'm very privileged to be your moderator for today. I'd like to also thank Isabel for being our tech support. I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where as a settler, I have a responsibility to the land and my hosts. I'm very honored to introduce you to Elder Margarita James. Elder James is a visiting scholar in residence at St. John's College, UBC, and is a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother of Filipino St'át'imc roots. We are so grateful to have her here today to open up this event. Thank you, Elder James. Elder James, would you like to open the event?
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. Oh, hello, everyone. Oh, greetings from Takana. I'm honored to open this gathering with Nan's prayer. Nan was one of our elders who has since passed, but she used to work in the school here for many years, her and Gloria McQuina. And I'm always honored to open any gathering with her words. Tsitsi kin kanish, kleko nas, kleko achachache, kleko nananiksukin, hopi ichin isak nananiksukin, hopi ichin isak omiaksu nisma, kleko nas. I'd like to say I'm honored to have been asked to participate in this webinar, and just wanted to acknowledge our territory here, where I live here at Sahana in Mowichat-Machlat territory of the Nuu-chah-nulth. And I'm not sure where everybody is from, but that's where I'm from with my words of prayer, words of love, words, spiritual thinking and beliefs for you as we embark on this venture. So I wanted to also acknowledge and bless all who are here with the words, and may the spirit of life and teachings be with us here as we gather and do this good and lasting work for all of humanity. Everything that we do is so important for all of the people of this world, and to say kleko nas and to acknowledge my teachings from the elders in my life, my grandmother, Ambrose McQuina, Arnold James, Tom and Veronica Dick, you know, it's all so important that we keep those teachings and we use what we learn. So that's why I always feel honored to say the prayer and to acknowledge some of those people that we've lost recently. In our community with COVID, we've lost so many elders. It's been really tragic and sad. But like I said, we always remember those teachings and honor what they've left us, their legacy of education, knowledge, which is what I'm sharing with you today. So I understand that the board has lost an esteemed member, Ada Kuno. So if Pat or somebody would wanted to follow up with honoring her life and her involvement with this group. So to go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Elder Margarita James, for that prayer, that lovely prayer. Last March the 10th, former Pacific Canada Heritage Centre Museum of Migration Society, or PCHC-MoM Director, Ada Khan passed away. Although she'd been struggling with serious health issues for a long time, she consistently took a positive approach. In front of colleagues and visitors, she was calm. Ada was an active community member for many years. After her retirement, serving as a librarian with the Fraser Valley Regional Library for 35 years, she returned to her family home in Vancouver, Chinatown, and participated and volunteered in numerous book clubs, organizations, and festivals. Her interests included travel, attending theater, films, historic, and cultural events. During her tenure as a director with PCHC-MoM, she was an all-round volunteer and served at times as a membership committee and a nominating committee member and as a board secretary. On behalf of PCHC-MoM, I'm happy to announce that this My Journey, My Roots series will be dedicated to the memory of Ada Khan. I now return the virtual talking stick to our moderator, Stephanie.
Thank you, Pat, for your tribute to Ada. We will miss her dearly. And thank you, Elder James, for this prayer and all that you do. The International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination marks the day in 1960 when the police in Sharpeville, a Black township in South Africa, opened fire on a group of people peacefully protesting oppressive laws. The police officers killed 69 people. The anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre is remembered around the world on March 21st as the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Joining us today is an incredible panel of speakers. Vivian Rygnestad is a PCHD director, a retired school principal, and an active member of the Japanese Canadian community. She is committed to learning and teaching others about Japanese Canadian history. Dr. Joann Anokwuru is a PCHD secretary. She received the Canadian International Black Women of Excellence Award in 2022 and has been recognized as one of Canada's top 100 Black women to watch. Nina Marie Villa Rodriguez is Chicano-Mexican American and Dutch German. Her business, Kairaza Foods, is an Indigenous female-led social enterprise and an online grocery store selling 100% Indigenous produced, traded, and sold foods and goods. Khater Deryabi is an Afghan-born activist and artist who campaigns for women's and refugees' rights. At the age of 14, she fled to Canada as a refugee and is now a student at the University of British Columbia, Sauder, pursuing a dual degree on a full scholarship. Khater continues to use her art, public speaking, and projects to advocate for the rights of women and refugees. We are also joined by contributors of the book 1923, Challenging Racism's Past and Present. Dr. Timothy J. Stanley teaches and researches anti-racism education. As a historian of the Chinese in Canada, he is particularly interested in the relations between histories of racist exclusion, historical representation, and contemporary racisms. Dr. Carmen Rodriguez de France is a member of the Department of Indigenous Education at the University of Victoria, who embraces her heritage from the Kickapoo Nation in northeastern Mexico. Dr. John Price is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Victoria and has been warm-heartedly referred to as the mastermind behind challenging racist British Columbia 150 years and counting. John, could you briefly talk about how the book 1923 arose?
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you to PCHC-MoM for organizing this event. I come from a white settler family that took Kwantlen land just after World War I, and I'm speaking from the Hul'qumi'num-speaking Salish peoples territory along the Fraser River. For the past 20 years, I've had the privilege of working with Asian Canadian communities, and more recently with Indigenous colleagues and communities as well. Out of that process came relationships with a number of writers and researchers from Indigenous, Black, and Asian Canadian communities. With the prospect of British Columbia making a big deal of the 150th anniversary of this province joining Canada, a number of us came together to produce the booklet Challenging Racist British Columbia, 150 Years and Counting. This booklet was well received and is still extensively used and will make its website available through the chat. With last year being the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we decided to bring authors together again and produced the booklet 1923, Challenging Racisms Past and Present, to explain the origins of that act, showing it was a reaction to an upsurge in social movements in the decade preceding. In 2021, PCHC co-sponsored the launch of Challenging Racist British Columbia, and we deeply appreciate PCHC organizing this event on this important day that highlights 1923 Challenging Racisms Past and Present. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, for providing the background on 1923. I'm now going to pass the floor to Tim and Carmen, who will set the themes for today's discussion on the past, present, and future of anti-racism in BC. Tim, you can go ahead.
So, I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and I honor them as keepers of this land, past, present, and future. It's also known as the City of Ottawa. It's only appropriate that this panel mark the anniversary of the Sharpeville Massacre. Many of the practices of the apartheid regime in South Africa were in fact copied from Canada, not least of which were Canada's policies on Indian affairs, including the pass system. Not so long ago in Canada, how you were racialized determined whether you could vote, whether your family could immigrate, where you could live, and what work you could do. This racism was not coincidental. It was not the result of prejudice, ignorance, or even of bad intentions. It was integral to the making of Canada and continues to this day. Racisms are best understood as social structures of exclusion that organize our relations with each other. In Canada, racist social structures are directly tied to the settler colonialism through which invaders from Europe and especially Britain converted the land and resources of Indigenous peoples into their own private property. Over time, the practices associated with this dominance have come to be taken for granted as just the way things are. For example, I'm speaking to you today in English, an invader language whose dominance was established through the systematic exclusion of Indigenous peoples and of their languages, which were spoken on this territory for millennia. Keeping those who might threaten this dominance out of the country has been central to this project. For example, the Chinese arrived on the west coast of what is today British Columbia at the same time that the British did. And in fact, arriving at Nootka Sound, where Elder James has been speaking from, or is also in her traditional territory. And the Chinese have been continuously present since the 1858 gold rush. Although Chinese languages have been spoken continuously in BC for 166 years, they are still seen as foreign, and it's still seen as a foreign language. At the time of the Chinese arrival, it was actually little more than the St. Lawrence Great Lake Valley. Following Confederation, British Upper Canadian invaders created white minority rule in British Columbia by blocking Indigenous people and Chinese people from voting. At the time, the Indigenous people, the First Nations, were at least 5 times the size of the white population, and the Chinese may have been the next largest group. Other legislation blocked both groups from claiming the land stolen from Indigenous peoples. By 2014, 1/10 of all the laws passed in BC's history discriminated against the Chinese. In 1885, this man, John A. Macdonald, extended the Chinese disenfranchisement federally for fear that Chinese property owners would control the vote in British Columbia. As he explained, Canada was to be an, quote, Aryan country, and the Chinese threatened this. By the early 20th century, the idea that the Chinese and other Asians not only did not belong in Canada, but that they threatened white dominance was widely taken for granted. It was the stuff that was commonly repeated in the popular press, in the speeches of politicians, and was even taught in elementary schools. In 1923, a moral panic over Asian exclusion, over Asian land ownership, the white-only Parliament of Canada passed the Chinese Immigration or Chinese Exclusion Act. Between 1923 and 1947, when the act was in force, 1.5 million Europeans were admitted to Canada, and only 44 Chinese people were. The act required all people of Chinese origin, including the Canadian-born, to register with the government and made their certificates of registration open to inspection at any time without notice. Those who failed to register or to produce a valid certificate faced fines, imprisonment, and deportation. And the act destroyed people's lives and marked the Canadian-born as eternal foreigners. It's important to note that Chinese Canadians didn't just react to this, didn't just accept this passively, but actively resisted this organized racism. They organized for their rights, they organized to provide mutual aid and to circumvent racist practices. For example, in 1923, Chinese Canadian delegates stopped the deportation of tens of thousands of people by convincing the Senate to drop a requirement in the Exclusion Act that all foreign-born Chinese pass a literacy test or be deported. People like this man, Juan Alexander Camillo, the first Canadian-born Chinese, fought for the right to vote their entire lives. Here he is voting for the first time in the 1949 federal election at the age of 88. Today, if people in Canada have democratic and other human rights, it's because of people like Camillo. Although much of this legislated racism has disappeared because of the resistance of various groups, including Chinese Canadians, the legacy of this racism and its active forms continues. Racist exclusions continue to shape the languages we speak in public, our European-derived institutions, the names of our streets, the layout of our cities, and what we are taught about the past. When read against the resulting cultural landscapes, Chinese Canadians and members of other racialized groups are positioned as those who do not belong or those whose presence need explanation, while people of European origins are assumed to naturally belong. Remaking these landscapes requires organizing, finding allies, and building a movement that forces the governments that created these landscapes in the first place to recreate them in ways that include all the peoples who live in this territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for your presentation on racism as a social structure and further contextualizing it with the many racist structures in BC's history. Carmen, would you like to present on today's state of anti-racism in BC?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to PCH PCHC-MoM for the invitation to be with all of you here today. And kleko to Elder Margarita for the words, for the blessings, for the prayers. I would like to start first just acknowledging with deep respect and gratitude the land, the ancestors, and those yet to be born, the lands of the Hasanich nations, the land of the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples, where I have been very privileged to live for the past 27 years. Coming from northeastern Mexico, where I also express deep respect and gratitude to my ancestors, to my land. At the same time that I express my gratitude and respect and my privilege, I also want to acknowledge the responsibility that I hold for living on these lands, the responsibilities I hold to my colleagues in the Department of Indigenous Education, to my communities, and to my students. I would like to invite us to reflect on social justice education, anti-racist education, and in a larger scope, looking at social justice, being reminded of what educators like Oslam Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo remind us, in that the way that we make sense of the world is often invisible to ourselves. But we cannot address issues of social justice without first examining the maps we're using to identify the problem and conceptualize the solutions. Our responses to social justice issues will depend on the problem, where the problem is located, and what we see as our role in the problem. And by problem here, we are referring to anti-racism approaches and racism in society, in our schools, in our communities. I am an educator, and more specifically, educator of future teachers. So these approaches to anti-racism are always in my mind, in my practice. And so today the invitation is for us to think about the upcoming legislation, for example, that probably you are all aware of, upcoming anti-racist legislation in British Columbia, and consider how legislation will likely, hopefully, bring us into a different level of understanding racism and anti-racist practices, but also invite us to consider what legislation might not do, and how legislation is not one way out of solving issues around social justice and social injustice, racism and anti-racism approaches. So we're going to go onto this website to watch briefly this video. It's a 2-minute video, and it's an overview of what the Anti-Racism Act proposes. Here. If it doesn't load, then I'll just briefly what it is here. In the caption, it says here that BC has announced new legislation in an attempt to dismantle systemic racism and discrimination faced by Indigenous, Black, and people of color. The Anti-Racism Data Act will help identify gaps in government programs and services in an effort to better understand where supports are needed. And again, I invite us to think about how this idea to dismantle systemic racism will be approached. This video is taking a little bit longer. this is the issue with technology. We're just going to skip the video.
Maybe we can come back to this somewhere in between.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to go to my other screen. Okay. Okay, so we'll have to, okay. This is the last try, but if it doesn't go, it doesn't go. Okay, so we will have to come back to this video later on. The idea, I'm just going to stop sharing and then come back to my screen. The idea behind us considering this new legislation is, as I said before, just to see and consider how legislation will not be a one-way out or the only option that we will have to think about social justice and anti-racist education.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for providing information on anti-racist education and legislation, and also how to think about those critically. Those are great reflections to reflect on. Great questions to reflect on. Let's hear it from our other panelists. So Vivian, would you like to share first?
Hello, everyone. I was asked to provide a personal story of racism in BC. And a bit of a background about my family. My father's father came to Canada in 1897, so our family has been here for 127 years. All right, 1941, my mother was a happy young woman working and living with her family in Kitsilano. She, along with two friends, they took a bus to downtown to a movie. As they were getting off the bus, 3 or 4 well-dressed, middle-aged white women were standing waiting to get onto the bus. All of a sudden, they started yelling derogatory comments. They called the Japanese by the derogatory term of Japs, screaming and yelling, "Get out of our country, go back to where you belong. Get out of here." My mother said she was surprised, but then all of a sudden, a big gob of spit hit my mother's cheek. And that's when my mother said she just stopped, completely stopped, stunned, shocked, and realized that it was true. People did hate her because of her Japanese ancestry. Her parents had warned her about, she knew about curfews. She knew about having to register because she was of Japanese ancestry. And she said, she remembers thinking, they really do hate me. They don't know me, but they just hate me. 80 years later, 2021, I was in a grocery store here in Richmond, early in the morning, standing in the produce section, kind of looking and wondering what kind of vegetables I was going to buy to roast for dinner. It was early morning. There were a few other people in the produce department. All of a sudden, I heard shouting, yelling. And I turned my head to see who it was. And there was a woman walking up towards me, stomping up towards me, her fingers jabbing towards me, screaming and yelling, "Killer, killer, you're a killer. Go back to where you belong. You people brought COVID to our country. You're killers. Go back to where you belong. We don't want you here. Where's your mask? You're a killer. You're not wearing a mask." I was stunned, absolutely stunned, in shock. She ran off. And then I became angry. So I stomped around the store, going up and down all the aisles, looking for her, at the same time thinking, what'll I say to her when I see her? But I didn't see her. But I did notice that no one else in the store was wearing a mask. Not even the people who work in the store were wearing a mask. I bought a couple of things. I went up to the cashier. And the cashier was very nice and said, "Oh, good morning. I hope you found everything you wanted. I hope you're having a good day." I burst into tears. I stood there at the cashier, looking at the cashier, crying and crying, tears pouring down my cheeks. And he said, "Are you okay? What happened? What happened?" The manager came and offered to take me in to sit down, have a cup of tea. And I said, "No, I just need to go home." I told them what had happened. I got in the car to drive home, phoned my daughter, who lives on Vancouver Island, and told her what had happened. She said she was going to come over right away. And I said, "Okay, no, I'll be fine. I'll be fine." I drove home, but I couldn't get out of the car because all I could think of was, there's nobody in the house. It's just me. So I kept driving. And about 10 minutes later, I remember thinking, I don't know what I'm doing, just driving. It's not solving anything. Went back into the house, phoned my daughters, and talked to them. The next day, I did talk to a couple of friends, and their comment was, "You've got to get onto TV, radio, tell people what happened to you. Social media, put it into Facebook, write it into LinkedIn or whatever. Tell everybody what happened to you. You've got to broadcast this." And I remember thinking, no, because then I'll just become another, "Oh dear, what a terrible story, what a horrible thing happened to that lady. Did you hear about what happened to that lady?" And then they'd forget about it. I'd become just another statistic. So I decided, and I guess it was the educator in me, I decided that instead of going to social media, I would talk to people I know. I would talk to people, tell them what happened, in hopes that I could educate them, help them to understand, hope that they would understand. So I did. I started telling people I know, and I went the next day to where I volunteer, told a few people there. But what absolutely surprised me was the reactions of people that I considered to be my friends. Often I got comments like, "Well, I wouldn't do such a thing. I see everybody as the same. Vivian, you're the same as everybody else. You're no different than everybody else." Why would they say that to you? Or people would say, "Why did she pick on you, Vivian?" And I remember saying, "Have you looked at my face lately?" They kept saying things like, a couple of men that I had worked with, who I valued their judgment, I explained to them, and they said, "Oh, Vivian, you know that in our job as school principals, we often get people yelling at us and people who are unhappy. It just kind of irks you. Just slough it off." She was having a bad day. It surprised me that people really didn't understand. And then I kept thinking, why did it hurt me so much? And I realized it was because it was completely based on what I look like. It had nothing to do, she didn't know me. It had nothing to do with what I had done or not done in my job or my driving or anything. And I was surprised. I was absolutely surprised, but I continued on with talking to people and explaining to them what happened and why I felt the way I felt. And I like to think that people did come back to me, often days later, to say, "I've been thinking about what you said." And it's way more than just, "Oh, well, she was having a bad day." So I tell you the two stories, the one of my mother and the one that happened to me. That was 80 years ago and just a couple of years ago at the beginning of COVID. Have things changed? Are things changing? How can we make it change? How can people react to being the victim of racism? And how can people react to when they witness racism? That is what I'm working on now and hoping to educate people on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for sharing your stories, your multi-generation story, really putting things into perspective about the aggressions we still experience today. Khatra, would you like to go next in sharing your personal histories?
Yeah, of course. I do want to acknowledge, thank you guys, all of you, for coming here. And Vivian, I'm really moved by your story. it really reminded me of some of the stories that I had in Afghanistan, which I completely forgot that side of story, which is something that I would want to share. To those of you who don't know me, I'm Khatu Teryapi, and I bring today forth the stories that was born from pain and resilience and now hope from Afghanistan and now as Afghan Canadian. So I stand here before you, not just as an individual, but as a voice for those who have been silenced, feared, and in many ways misunderstood because of their skin color, accent, or heritage. So today I really want to extend this conversation to the layered identities that I navigate as an Afghan Canadian Muslim in the context of the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination. From my personal observation and some of the experiences, so the journey of carrying a culturally Muslim identity is often fraught with the unique challenges in a society where prejudice is often masqueraded as security concerns. I mostly fear for my parents who are new arrived refugees or immigrants here and Muslim communities who are wearing hijab to express their faith. This acts of identity can lead to being excluded, which one of the professors mentioned as racial exclusion, or even targeted or marked as not Canadian because we have to look in certain ways, act in certain ways to be called Canadian. So we saw this during the Israel-Gaza war, where 2 Muslim girls were attacked on UBC campus for wearing hijab. That day, with fear, I immediately called my dad, please do not wear any scarf outside that spots you as a Muslim. But I totally forgot his dark skin color. On the other hand, that Vivian made me reflect on this story when I was born and raised in Afghanistan, and I left Afghanistan at age 14. All my life, all 14 years of my life, I was called flat nose. And that was mainly because we are from a minority, which is called Hazara, which has been under genocide for decades and decades, and still it's unrecognized. So to them, we were always outsiders. We were called, go to Mongolia, go to China, you don't belong here because we look differently. On another example, my experiences with being mistaken identity, being approached in Chinese or many other languages, or facing stereotypes about my Afghan heritage and now Canadian identity based on my appearance or the language that I speak, which highlights a greater societal inclination to judge books by their covers, overlooking the rich stories and experiences and everything that we bring with ourselves to this new country. It's forgotten. So people are usually quick to box us in categories, which is based on surface level attributes, disregarding our unique identities, the stories, and all the skills and lived experiences that we could offer this country to thrive together to make this country a better place for all of us. So the demand for, on the other hand, the demand for assimilation, which is usually disguised as integration, urges us to abandon our cultural identity, our accent, and native language, and deem our cultural and religious expression or practices, which is further eroding the essence of true diversity. We say diversity, but where is the real diversity, the practical diversity? This not only fosters isolation and mental health issues, but also contradicts the nurturing of a cohesive community, which makes the needs for having a supportive community more urgent than ever, because right now we are in the epidemic of isolation. Dr. Bruce Lipton's work was mentioning that we understand that our beliefs, including those about race and identity, profoundly affects our collective well-being. But let's not forget, we are the cause of all these issues, especially if we don't take any initiative. So tackling racism requires a dual approach, in my opinion, nurturing individual openness and advocating for systematic educational reforms. So individually, we must cultivate curiosity and open-hearted conversation, seek education, embrace diversity, and actively participate in discussion and events that expand our perspective. So we don't just assume, we don't often judge with our biases. On a collective front, I think it's important to push for institutional reforms, incorporating mandatory education on racism's history into our curriculums to cultivate a future where diversity is tolerated and celebrated. So the embodiment of cohesive education about racism's history and impact on our education system is imperative that could foster and will foster a generation that values diversity at its core. I did my high school here and I haven't had not even a single course or subject that talked about racism and racism history. So I'm one of the other generation that I would be oblivion of what is happening and would consistently judge other people based on how they look and assumes that they are, or back to that categorizing and boxing people. So this is when individually I have the responsibility to teach myself to ask questions. On the other hand, I really want to challenge, or let's all of us challenge the norm of making assumptions and embrace genuine curiosity about each other's background. Let's foster curiosity through a simple question. Where are you from? Tell me more. I want to learn about you, without any presumptions. So by recognizing these challenges, all or some marginalized communities that face, including Muslims community in Canada or BC, and advocating for systematic change, we can begin to untangle the complex web of prejudice which is ingrained in our society in our BC. My favorite quote from Albert Einstein is, as one said, "We cannot solve problems at the same level of thinking that we were at when we created those problems." So let us change our views through a dual approach, individually and collectively, to eradicate racism and provide loving community where we all thrive together, because together we can achieve more. Otherwise, we will see ourselves in an overwhelming, redundant routine trying to fight racism alone. This starts from you, me, and all of us. So let us own our power. Let us commit to changing the narratives around racism and discrimination. And together we can envision and work towards a world where diversity is not accepted, but not only accepted, but celebrated, ensuring that every individual is respected for their unique identity and beauty. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Khatra, for sharing your experiences in which you really felt your layers of marginalized identities, shining light on the importance of having a supportive community, and reminding all of us to be curious in learning about each other's culture and heritage. Next, could we please hear from Joann?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm excited to be here. And can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. So this year, the 2024 theme to commemorate the International Day for Elimination and Racial Discrimination. Going back to United Nations, the theme says a decade of recognition, justice, and development. Implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent. And why is this year why do we have that theme, African Descent? This year is linked to the Decade for People of African Descent, going from 2015 all the way to 2024, which is this year. And we know the reason behind this day, going back to when 69 people were killed by police people in Sharpeville, 69 people protesting against the apartheid laws. This day, again today, is recognizing that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted, protected, celebrated, and revered. Quite a huge population of people of African descent live outside Africa continent, going back again to the time of slavery, the transatlantic slavery, where over 200 million people were taken away from the land and moved over to the Turtle Island and to Europe. And so now, today, I'm standing on the shoulders of my African ancestors and elders, saying this is a call to action. Racism, racial discrimination harms not just only the lives of those who endure it, but also as a society. For me, being Black, for others around me, my family, the fight against racism is everyone's fight. A society and people characterized by discrimination, division, distrust, hate crimes, intolerance ends up nothing but in chaos. And I come up with this question: why do you see my color first? Why don't you see me as a person? Those intersectionality, the color, being woman, being someone who you don't recognize, starts with that space of hate, that space of crime. And in 2018, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he announced that the government of Canada will officially recognize the International Decade for People of African Descent. And so therefore, in 2017, the IRCC published a 16-page report on steps taken by Canada to protect the human rights of people of African descent. And one of those recommendations, they actually came up with 16 recommendations. And one is the implications and the use of the word visible minority. No one is visible. We all live, we all exist on this land in Canada, and recognize that also people of African descent are a distinct group. So they should be given a voice and not the hate crime. And I will quickly like to share a story of something that my daughter did last year in BC. She set up a group of young girls, of young kids, and she wanted them to share their stories. She actually spoke about this, and she was like, one of the kids there was excited, like this is the first time. Not only is she in the midst of people she recognized, but she felt safe. When do we stop this? How can we move away from our comfort zone and go into spaces and feel safe, not just amongst only our Black people, but amongst everyone? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joann, on your talk on being how anti-racism is everyone's responsibility. We must all celebrate and advocate for human rights. And on the same line as Khatra, you also touched on the importance of community and feeling safe in spaces. Next, could we please have Nina share your personal history? Nina?
Hi there. Sorry. I'm out actually at a farm. My service isn't that good. Hi everyone. My name is Nina Marie Villa Rodriguez, and in 2006 I moved to Canada as a temporary foreign worker. I'm Mexican American. I moved here to avoid the economic downturn in the States in 2006 and 2008 and 2009. I come from a family of migrant farm workers, poverty. I'm mixed Indigenous on both sides of my family. And my grandfather was a migrant farm worker, and our family always told stories. He didn't talk about it a lot, but he migrated from Mexico to a beet farm, and he was mistreated. And what I have to say about my own story is that in Canada and British Columbia, it really was difficult for me to develop my career as a woman of color in Canada, and it really wasn't until I became 40, 41, 42 that I was able to transcend the difficulties that I had had, and I really did not start educating myself on the struggles and the identity politics around migrant labor, and identity and the treatment of temporary foreign workers. I mean, it's been really difficult for me being in Canada, and I speak English, and I'm of lighter skin, and you know, BC employs, I'm going to stray from my personal story and maybe just talk about what's going on in BC. And I have people that I work with, who are Mexican, who have experienced mistreatment. There's 550 farms here in BC that employ Mexican migrant workers. 5,000 of them were interviewed. I was not interviewed, but over 40% have substandard housing on farms, nurseries, things like that, where housing is included in their employment, in our employment. The conditions are completely horrible, especially during COVID. The housing is cramped, leaving them exposed, and there's higher rates of sickness. Our employers are not following laws, regulations. Our work's not being recognized, or it's not even being valued. In 2012, I had a colleague who also came to Canada from Mexico as a temporary foreign worker, and his employer lied to him. The employer presented him with one job, but as soon as he got here, the employer quickly changed his job duties to being strictly labor, which is completely against BC labor laws, immigration laws, and things like that. So these are the countless stories that I hear, all the time from my colleagues. I myself, I have been denied promotions. I've been completely overworked in some companies. Overtime, employers basically stealing my time and my pay, and not being compensated properly. I have stood up for myself in these situations, and I have lost jobs because of it. I think about the position that my grandfather was in, someone that had less resources than myself. I'm third generation, so American. So I would say, how do we look at how we are contributing, or someone who is not Mexican or not in the farming and agriculture and labor industry, what are we buying? Who are we buying it from, and what's happening on these farms where we're buying our produce? There's an organization in the States called the UFW, it's United Farm Workers, and it was started by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and they advocate for migrant workers, specifically Mexican and Chicano workers working in the States. But we don't have something like that here in BC. And a lot of these employers, especially during COVID, a lot of the inspections were virtual. I think these organizations are completely understaffed that oversee these programs. And it's affected my life. It's affected, my colleagues' lives. And I just keep hearing stories over and over again. And I really think that, you know, we as a collective, as a province, as a country, the world, we need to really start looking at where our food sources are coming from and where our resources are coming from. You know, where like a strawberry or a carrot, you know, more than likely someone gave their life for that due to, you know, especially with climate change, heat stress, just the working conditions are quite terrible. And I just really encourage people to, you know, follow stories about temporary foreign workers working in your area. You know, if you drive around Surrey and Langley and different parts of BC where there are farms, you can see migrant workers working in the fields. And, you know, you're usually at a distance when you're driving. You know, but unless you're in the field or in that world, I don't really think people know in detail what's occurring and what has to happen for you to get your you know, your plants, your trees. I do horticulture, but you know, to get your carrots, to be honest, it's quite similar to the, you know, the history of diamonds and resources and mining. You know, we call diamonds blood diamonds that come, you know, that come from Africa or similar, because, you know, it's enslavement in order to extract resources. Well, food is a resource, and, you know, the similar is happening in BC, basically, you know, in your backyard. So, you know, these things weigh heavily on myself, and, you know, I really think about my struggles being similar to my grandfather's, definitely not as hard, you know. But I really think that people just need to be more aware of these things and really take the time to think about these things while they're at the grocery store. You know, buying from Indigenous owned farms, stores, and just researching these farms. You can look on, you know, various BC and Canadian government websites, and have a look at these produce companies and these nurseries and all these other businesses that employ migrant farm workers, temporary foreign workers, and you will see, you won't be shocked, but you will see violations of some very familiar names here in British Columbia and Canada. You know, immigration violations and things like this. So, so these are my feelings today on what's happening to myself and others.
Thank you for sharing, Nina, and being so vulnerable. It was incredibly inspiring to watch. It takes a lot of courage. Thank you for sharing your experiences as a woman of color and also addressing some of the unequal treatment that migrant farm workers endure. Your key message that we need advocates for Mexican, Chicano migrant farm workers here in BC is well heard. And as consumers, we should think about how we're contributing to this, you know, what are our responsibilities? And I think Nina recommended some really great action items. You know, I encourage everyone to follow stories of farm workers in BC and to become and stay aware. And also we'll be linking Kairaza Foods in the chat, so please go check her out. Next, Elder James, would you like to share?
Oh, thank you for asking me again. Uklas Jacob, Klao Margarita James, Muchlat Aksops, Uhunuiuksu Euphemia Stager, Sladlam Aksops Meat, Uhunuiuksu Salvador Reyes Tirasona, Filipino Naat. I'm really honored as a human person to have a blended history. My father's Filipino. He came to the United States in 1927 on a steamship. And my mother was from Mount Currie. They met in Seattle. Indigenous people used to go across the border and pick hops and berries. And she did that as a young girl and ended up in Seattle and met my father, who used to migrate from, when he came over in 1927, used to work in the fields in California and travel up and spend his money en route and work in the fish canneries in Alaska. So he would travel back and forth, and that's how he met my mom in Seattle. So that's how I came to be. I'm currently a fellow in residence at UBC with St. John's College and the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. They've asked me to share my story, so I'm working on a master's program there. So I'm really busy. I have a 15-year-old grandson that lives with me and an 18-year-old granddaughter. So my life is full. But I wanted to share just a little bit about my experience in our community. Like I mentioned earlier, I live at Tsakana in Nuchanoth territory. We're one of the 13 member nations of the Nuchanoth, anthropologically known as Nootka. And what ties Nuchanoth together is the language. Our nation has the largest land base in all of Nuchanoth, Mowichat Muchlat. We have 18 designated reserves in our territory. Our #1 reserve is a Canadian National Historic Site. It was designated in 1923, interesting year, for Nootka Sound. The Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada designated 2 sites in the province of British Columbia, Fort Langley and Nootka Sound. That designation was because of the European history. It was because a fellow named Captain Cook visited. The Spanish were there in 1784. I might have that year wrong. But it was because of that European history that the government of Canada felt it was an important site to Canada. So that's a bit of the work that I've been doing since I came into the community. I got smitten with a Nootka man, and I consider myself a newbie. I've only been here 42 years. My husband and I met in Seattle while I was going to school, working for King County Jail. And so he decided he wanted to move home. So we moved here. And I've been here ever since. And just happy to be here. My children are from here, my grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. So like I said earlier, my life is full. But I work a lot with Parks Canada. The designation said nothing, when the government commemorates sites. The original designation in 1923 said nothing about the Indigenous history, nothing. They erect these nice little brass plaques, and when you go up and read it, it says nothing about Chief Maquina, who is our honored chief. It says nothing about the people, the Indigenous people. So in my 42 years being here, working with Parks Canada, developing tourism businesses, with the Provincial Ministry of Tourism, using my skills. I can write, I can speak a little bit. And so I've been working on that for many years. We had that plaque wording changed. Chief Makwina Ambrose, Ambrose Makwina, Chief Jerry Jack, Max Savy gave me a name when Arnold and I, my husband, traditionally adopted 2 boys into the community. We would take children in. We adopted a young fella from Montana, who's Blackfeet, and his mom was from Coeur d'Alene. And then we traditionally adopted my nephew into the community. So that's how I got my name, Jakob. And she was a very, very sharing person. So I've always been honored to have that name.
Thank you, Elder James, for sharing about your heritage. Due to the time, we're going to move on to the next portion, which is discussion. Yeah, so I'm going to send the 2 questions that Carmen has brought up earlier. Does anyone want to maybe reflect on how does my worldview allow me to participate in expressions of social justice and equity, or how do I become complicit in promoting injustice, racism, discrimination, and other forms of exclusion, or just anything else that they'd like to add, maybe about the book, or their personal experiences? Yeah, John, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thanks to everyone for sharing their stories. I'm hesitant to speak at this moment after hearing these stories, but in terms of my own personal experience, I just want to say that, how profoundly what has been happening in the Middle East has affected me. And as we remember the origins of this day, commemorating the sacrifices of those in Sharpeville in South Africa, I want to acknowledge the importance and my respect for the government of South Africa today for having brought to the International Court of Justice the case against Israel for violations of the Genocide Convention. As we watch the daily atrocities being committed in Gaza and elsewhere, I think it's really important to acknowledge the existence of anti-Palestinian racism as well as Islamophobia, and take actions in the coming days and weeks and months to counter the impacts of this and to seek peace and justice in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for touching on a very important topic and for being the voice of a group that we don't have representing as a personal history, but thank you, John, for touching on that. Does anyone else want to speak? Oh, I see Vivian has her hand raised. Vivian, go ahead.
I often think that it's more important for the word anti-racism to be used instead of just I'm not racist, because all too often, if someone is asked, are you racist? They'll say no, because really to be racist is bad. And so there are a lot of people who go around and think I'm not racist. But in reality, it's a very comfortable place to be. I'm not racist. Whereas if you say I'm anti-racist, or you ask someone, are you anti-racist? It involves taking a stance. It involves doing something. And that's why I think it's so important to take away just the bit "I'm not racist" and start using anti-racist. Are you anti-racist? And use that as a term instead of "I'm not racist" or just racism. And I think all too often the word racism gets thrown around as and it's lost its impact. So let's use anti-racist from now on.
I completely agree. I think, especially in this day and age, we can't be afraid on taking stance because sometimes being neutral or being silent speaks louder than words. Does anyone else want to add anything? Go ahead, Carmen.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all of you who shared very candidly and very honestly your life experiences. One of those lives that I had initially for us to also pay attention to is what feminist scholar Judith Butler talks about in the book called Frames of War, When is Life Grievable? Butler invites us to think about how we learn and when we learn to value some lives over others. When we learn how to see lives outside of our immediate spheres as valuable and worthy of preserving. So Hatara, you talked about education. Vivian, you also talked about education. And again, as an educator, these are invitations in terms of reflecting on how our own worldviews and our life experiences allow us to participate in instances of social justice or invite us, sometimes unknowingly, to be the perpetrators of those racisms. And one other thing that I wanted to add, I agree with you, Vivian, in that we need to start using anti-racism. Dr. Bettina Love, who is an anti-racist scholar, says, for example, of things that we might sometimes take for granted. She gives an example of the awards that are given at institutions, sometimes universities, to students who have overcome challenges. And she says, instead of giving those awards, why don't we remove those challenges in the first place, right? Like instead of awarding people some money or some kind of trophy for overcoming challenges, let's remove those challenges. So it sounds sometimes, or it seems perhaps common sense, but my mother says that common sense is the least common of all senses because we talk about it, but we seldom use it. So again, these are invitations that come back to our self-reflection in our own standpoint and how we interact with the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. If there isn't anyone else, we can show Carmen's video. Or does anyone have anything? Oh, let's see. Let's have Tim and then we'll have Khatra after.
First of all, thank you so much to all of the panelists for sharing their experiences. I just wanted to say a couple of things. And first of all, I've been involved in anti-racism education in one form or another for over 40 years now. And during that time, although our vocabulary has changed, the issues haven't. And the central issue in anti-racism is about getting people to actually understand the realities and consequences of the racisms that surround them. This is something I lived through myself. I am born and raised in Montreal, but on my father's side, I am white Anglo-Saxon, the United Empire Loyalist stock, no less. But on my mother's side, I'm third generation Chinese Canadian. And I thought there wasn't any racism in Canada until I experienced the racism directed at me specifically. And that's how I got involved in things. So the thing we need to remember, though, is that anti-racism always begins with the resistance to racism of the people who are being excluded, being attacked. And anti-racism education begins with bringing their stories, their points of view, their ways of engaging the world into circulation. One of the ways the structure of racism works is that people who are privileged by it don't have to actually engage with those consequences. So that's just something to think about. And we do this in part by sharing these stories amongst each other and building alliances.
Thank you, Tim. Khatra?
Yeah, again, thank you all so much for having me here. It's truly an honor to hear your stories, and it's really inspiring. Not only me learning about your story, but it just brings a community together to be a better listener. And like outside of this community, outside of this Zoom call, what can we do to really dismantle the structure and the racism? A couple of things that I want to mention is, first of all, I think a lot of people ignore the fact that every individual holds the power to dismantle the structure of racial discrimination, right? Through their choices that they make each day. And because that our belief shapes our reality, right? And all of this starts with introspection, recognizing and challenging our own biases, which I kind of mentioned by asking questions, right? Because in each individuals with the best intention can harbor that unconscious biases that influence their decisions, and then their decision influence their behavior in the society, right? That's how a lot of people are racist, but they are not aware of it, or they consistently deny it, that I'm not racist, which kind of touches upon Vivian's point. So I think by becoming aware of these biases, and also knowing that every individual truly have a power to do something about these issues, we can take the deliberate steps to counteract them, whether it's through I don't know, expanding our social circles, consuming diverse media, or engaging in conversation about race and identity with an open heart. And I think especially for young minds, young generation, this truly empowers them to think critically and empathetically, especially when it comes to storytelling. So there's this quote kind of reminded me of what Vivian was saying, and Stephanie. If you're a neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor, right? So this is highlighting that our daily actions, no matter how small it is, contribute to the larger battle against discrimination. And then on the other thing, it's all without community, without people, we cannot move forward. There's no policy change. There's nothing, because community thrives on solidarity and shared values. So I just want to make sure that we really understand that, because it is crucial to find a common ground and unite in our human experiences, which we are doing here by sharing experiences and our stories. There's this quote from Martin Luther King, if I remember correctly, is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? Which means that engaging in community dialogue, supporting minority-owned businesses or people, participating in cultural exchanges, and standing together against these acts of discrimination. So I do want to emphasize that it's really important to bridging the divides by listening to understand, not to always respond. And this really helps us to foster environments where everyone's voice is heard, valued, and we build this resilient communities that can withstand the forces of this huge polarization that we see every single day, and emerge strong in a beautiful, diverse society that we can just be ourselves and express that. Thank you for the chance.
Thank you, Khatra. Yeah, I think you brought up a really important point about how to be anti-racist, we need to take a step back, way back, to also relive our own experiences and to confront our own prejudice. I think, at least for myself, something that I learned, Vivian. I was just going to talk about internalized racism and how that's, I feel like, often overlooked. Go ahead.
Last summer, I was fortunate in meeting First Nations Aboriginal elder just outside of Nanaimo. And we were talking about human rights, and that was the actual topic, was human rights. I like what I learned from him when he said, it's not human rights, it's human responsibilities. All too often when you call it human rights, people think it's my right, my right, my right is more important than yours. And I believe firmly that when it comes to things like racism, we all share the responsibility of doing something. We all have influence in our own worlds. We may not have billions of dollars like a government, and you can't just throw money at it. So I believe strongly that we all have influence, and we could use that influence in our daily lives. It's a responsibility that I have as a human, that I could do something. So instead of waiting around for big things to happen, I think it's really important that I love the term human responsibilities. We all take responsibility in each and every one of us in our daily lives to do what needs to be done and what we believe in. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Vivian. Would anyone else like to contribute to the discussion? If not, we can, oh, Paul, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'd like to draw our attention, when we talk about social justice, these days, when you watch international news, the world is changing drastically. A lot of things are happening around the world. That will eventually impact social justice in our society, let's say in Canada or in BC or in Vancouver. As a Chinese, not too long ago, several decades ago, we were looked down upon as, people of a inferior race. And suddenly, within a few decades, we could be seen as a threatening race because China has changed from a very poor country to a very, so-called rising country and getting strong in many aspects, especially economically. So our position in a society, in this society, actually drastically changes, not necessarily anything happened within the society, but outside the country. That is what happens in the world, elsewhere in the world, like in China or in the Middle East or in Russia, Ukraine. So this is what I see, that how we need to now look at social justice from a more global perspective. We need to be sensitive to that. So this is what I've been thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Would any of the speakers like to add to that? If not, we can have Carmen's video if it's loaded.
Yeah, I don't think it loaded on my end. It just kept looping and looping. I don't know for whatever reason, but my internet was saying it was unstable. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it. So maybe we can put the link on the chat and then people can watch it. It's a 2.5-minute video that gives an overview of the upcoming legislation.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. You can go ahead and plop it in the chat. Let's see. We have some time for Q&A from our attendees if anyone would like to speak. I know we didn't cover all of the voices. Of course, anti-racism is experienced by everyone and is unique to everyone. And yeah, so we welcome the public to speak on it. Okay. Well, if you have any questions or any comments, oh, Anita, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you everyone for sharing your wonderful stories. I am at home a mess right now, so I'm going to stay off camera. I just saw the notification, if that's okay. So I really did appreciate the vulnerability and just I would say, what word am I trying to look for right now? Generosity of those who shared their stories and were able to, provide real life experiences about how racism affects racialized individuals. I just really wanted to reiterate the point made by one of the speakers about the importance of kind of moving beyond discourse. As an academic myself, one of the things I'm really tired of experiencing is people getting caught up with a lot of terms and concepts, and it seems like we forget the importance of action. So yes, I know that it's important to remain reflexive and to consider, the prejudices that you have and how certain preconceptions that you may have has an effect on individuals. I do believe that's a starting point. But time and time again, I come across certain organizations and institutions where they have all these wonderful policies, they use all these magical words, but the people are still being treated terribly. So I think that this message has been said many times tonight, but once again, it's very important for me to just call on those who are here to remember the importance of humanity and seeing people as people and understanding how your actions has a serious impact on those around you. And the final thing I'll say is this is once again very much related to what I was talking about, but with regards to systemic oppression, even the way that it's taught in a lot of these institutions today, it's seen as a concept once again, and a lot of people are able to just blame the system on everything. But we have to understand that people are the ones who continue to maintain and reinforce these systems. And at the end of the day, if we don't change and if we don't take accountability for a lot of the oppression that's ongoing, it will continue to occur. And this is coming from a Black woman living in Canada who continues to be met with a lot of responses about how we live in such a wonderful country, which I don't deny, but there are still a lot of problems that need to be addressed. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your story, but please just remember to take action in, the conversations that we're having today.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was very wonderful. Yeah, I agree 100%. I think the value in this webinar is that we're able to storytell and go beyond, I guess, the concepts and what we learn in school and really think about how we can take action. Khatra.
I just want to briefly mention, thank you so much for mentioning this point. I feel like as a poli-sci student, I come across a lot of people and a lot of things that we study, which is kind of like a common approach nowadays, who are thinking that they are fighting gender discrimination or racism by manipulating people. For example, they put like one color woman in their entire department and showing their picture, like, hey, we include diversity, but in reality, the way they would be treating them, they would not even include them in the conversation at all. So I think this is something that truly a lot of people need to notice, and this must stop, because otherwise it gives us a false impression and reinforcing, the whole idea of racism back, and make us to hate ourselves, right? Because it's so, I cannot even imagine how hard it is to be in that environment. So the key is, if people are in that environment, please advocate for yourself and always ask for help, because you're not alone. And yeah, thank you
so much, Khatra. I think you brought up a really important point about tokenization and how important it is to really validate yourself and your experiences, and how we can move to a genuine approach of anti-racism. I think that just about wraps up our webinar. There is a site with our resources, PCHC's resources, in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone, our guest speakers, our directors, and just our attendees. This is a wonderful evening to commemorate the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Have a great night.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all. Are we all leaving or
Oh,
staying?
go.
Go, Elder James.